So we're about to get started. First, we'll have a presentation from Katherine Trebeck, followed by a panel on planetary health equity. So firstly, let me introduce our speaker, who is Katherine Trebeck, to deliver an address on the measuring what matters, which sounds very important because, first of all, you have to know what matters before you measure it. And I'm excited to find out what that is. It's about how a well-being economy can achieve long-term social, environmental sustainability for a just transition. So Katherine Trebeck is a political economist, an economic change lead at the Next Economy. And we've got some Next Economy folks in, or just fans. She's co-founded the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and its Scottish hub as well. And she's a member of the Club of Rome. I don't know what that is, but it sounds fun. Do they have good music? No? Oh, what a shame. Catherine's an advocate for economic system change and also an author of The Economics of Arrival, Ideas for a Grown-Up Economy. Please welcome Katherine to the stage.
Thank you. Good morning. So I'm quite chuffed that you have chosen to hang out here and not watch the Trump-Harris debate. But if any of you are watching your phones, that's entirely cool because that's what I would be doing. And if there's any big dramas, just interrupt because I think we need to know in real time. So you have utter permission to keep an eye on this and an eye on what's going on. Is it in Philadelphia, I think? Yeah. I'm really delighted to be here. It's a real honour to be part of the Better Futures Australia. So thank you so much to the organisers who've done such a power of work bringing together so many different people and different perspectives. And I've been learning a lot. I think I've got about 20 pages of notes already. I particularly also want to add my acknowledgements to the traditional owners of this beautiful land, Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And Auntie Dr. Matilda, yesterday in that beautiful smoking ceremony, was telling you about a place called Red Hill that she hangs out in. This is Red Hill. This is a view from Red Hill, which is also a place I spend a lot of time. And so her welcome to country meant a lot to me because it was literally very, very close to my heart. So I've been asked to talk to you about the wellbeing economy agenda writ large and how the Measuring What Matters statement from the federal government fits into it. And I don't need to tell you this is the context in which we're having these conversations, and it's been great over the last day or so to hear people saying, yes, climate and emissions is utterly critical, but broadening it to some of the other challenges of breaching planetary boundaries that we're hearing about. What's also been great is the acknowledgement of the unequal impact, really talking about the 20% most vulnerable who are hardest hit. But I think we really need to marry that with the reality of who is most responsible as well, who it is who's putting most pressure on the planet. And this is research done by my former colleagues at Oxfam, really mapping globally by CO2 consumption-based emissions, who's most responsible for breaching of planetary boundaries and for CO2 emissions in this case. And rather ironically, it maps into a bit of an old-fashioned champagne glass, which is very telling. But the stark reality is that it's the richest 10% of the world who are emitting more than 50% of the emissions. And most of us would be in that category. And I think that's important to remember whenever anyone says something like, humanity is putting great pressure on the planet, show them this champagne glass, because we need to really remember that the sort of vulnerability in terms of who's hardest hit is really a reflection also in the inequality in who is most responsible. And that inequality, of course, is a function of how we design our economies. This, here you go, there's the champagne glass again. This, at the time that photo was taken, was the world's most expensive cocktail. It's called the Churchill. And it's congratulations, Melbourne. It's from a nightclub in Melbourne. And at the time it was selling for over $12,000. And this, we are a country where we have the fifth highest number of highest net worth individuals in the world, according to ACOS and the University of New South Wales. At the same time, as increasing levels of housing insecurity, food insecurity, and precariousness in work. And what happens is we've got people really, struggling to keep control of their lives, increasing levels of anxiety, increasing levels of self-harm. 1 in 7 of us are taking antidepressants regularly. We're in the top 3 in the OECD for levels of insecure work. And we then shouldn't be surprised when we see people here in Australia and globally reaching for coping mechanisms. And they're reaching for coping mechanisms at the pillbox and at the ballot box, as we see with the rise of populism. And here's another photo from Canberra, less pretty. This is one I tried to take out the window at the traffic lights. The stupidity of these two images together, I think, really sums up, in a way, the situation that we have in Australia, in that we're going, for the right things. We're going for health and for good lives and sense of dignity and sense of purpose in our lives and making sure everyone has enough. So that's the equivalent of going to the gym, doing all the good stuff. Yeah. And then at the same time, we're ducking over to Hungry Jack's and stuffing our face with a burger. And what I mean by that, and how it sums up the absurdity of today's system, is that despite all these good intentions, and we've heard a lot about amazing policies and amazing initiatives and people working so damn hard to build the sort of world we want, and yet we are still in a situation of what I call the sort of economic fundamentalism, where so often we see people and planet deprioritised to economic goals. And we see people thinking, well, if we just grow the economy bigger, that will be an automatic read across to addressing and solving so many of our problems. But it sort of sums up the sort of level of priorities. So what could be better? And this is where the wellbeing economy agenda comes in. And I've chosen this picture because there's this beautiful phrase that I think really, to me, is a bit of a life goal and a bit of a reminder. That beautiful phrase that says, if you are lucky enough to drink wine by the sea, you are lucky enough. Because so much is in place if you are able to drink wine by the sea. You have sufficient resources, it's safe to do so, you have a bit of spare income, but you don't have to have astronomical levels of income to purchase Churchill cocktails. And there's lots of different ways of describing what a better economic system could be. It might be about thriving within planetary boundaries. You might describe it as sustainable well-being. You might describe it as social justice on a healthy planet. But essentially, it is about taking a good hard look at our economic system and saying, how can it be very deliberately, very purposefully designed to deliver what people and planet need, first and foremost. And I tend to think of the idea of the wellbeing economy as a little bit like a picnic blanket, because there are so many extraordinary initiatives and ideas and visions of what a different economic system might look like. And you'll probably be familiar with many of them, whether it's donut economics or the care economy or participatory economy or Brin Vivir or First Nations economic thinking or the Commons agenda, economy for the common good. So many different ways of thinking about the economy. And the wellbeing economy is not about being a synonym and definitely not about being a competitor for those incredible visions and ideas. It's about saying, what are the common core goals that underpin all those different agendas? And one of the most critical ones is really, really reminding ourselves that the economy is not the end in itself, but it's the means. And how we think about the economy and how we design our economics ecosystem is utterly critical. And it's about moving from this thinking. And many of you, well, not many of you are old enough, but many of you who are around, you remember this depiction of sustainable development, these 3 pillars of economy, society, and the environment. I think that this image is one of the most dangerous images in the world. Because what it does is it implicitly lodges in your brain that the economy is on a par with society and the environment. And what all those beautiful different visions and different agendas on that wellbeing economy picnic blanket, what they have at their core is essentially This would have been a lot slicker if I essentially embracing what ecological economists have been telling us for decades, what feminist economists have been telling us for decades, and what First Nations communities around the world have been living for millennia. And that is that the economy is nested within society, and the two are nested within our precious natural world. But essentially, this is quite a fundamental rethinking of how we approach the economy. It's about rethinking the economy as a provisioning system, as in service of those higher order goals of social justice on a healthy planet. And that's really, really different to so often how the economy is talked about. And there was a discussion yesterday morning where I flinched a bit, where people were talking about, well, if we get more renewables, that's good for the economy. And I thought, oh. Or we talk about last year, there was a big report into sort of gender justice, and that was touted about as being, that will be good for the economy. What we need to do is flip that on its head and ask, how is the economy good for a healthy, thriving natural environment? How is the economy good for gender justice? So how do we get there? Well, it's obviously going to take a hell of a lot of changes. And I tend to think of the plethora of changes from the very, very local right up to the supranational as a bit like a picnic, a jigsaw puzzle. You've already heard about the picnic blanket, but a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. Lots and lots of different pieces, none of them sufficient on their own, but lots of them will start to add up to a different sort of economic system. And if any of you are doing jigsaw puzzles, you'll know that you start with the corners. And so how I cluster this jigsaw puzzle of shifts for a wellbeing economy is the 4 Ps, the 4 corners of the wellbeing economy jigsaw puzzle. And they all start with P. So they're purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and people-powered. And so purpose is about really thinking, what is the goal of the economy and its component parts? And this is where you see the agenda of measuring what matters and multidimensional measurement frameworks. This is where you hear things like more pro-social business models, more inclusive business models, but also rethinking what sort of economic activities do we need more of in our economy. Prevention is about saying we have to do better than just spending money after money after money downstream after the fact, fixing and repairing after the damage has been done. And ecological economists talk about that as defensive expenditure, and increasingly in social policy we're describing it as failure demand. Essentially lots of spending that's driven by our collective failure to create a situation that takes care of people, that where people have enough to keep a roof over their head and put food on the table for their children, have a sense of purpose and dignity. So the more circular our production and consumption systems, the less we'll be having to do beach cleanups on a Sunday morning. The more our jobs pay people enough to live on, the less the government will be having to budget for rent assistance. The fewer natural disasters, because we haven't polluted the planet beyond what Mother Nature can handle, the less our government will be spending on disaster relief emergency payments. The more jobs give a sense of dignity and purpose, the less our GPs will be having to write prescriptions for anti-anxiety treatments. And so it's not saying that that work downstream is unimportant, because it's utterly critical, isn't it? It's about helping people and planet survive and cope in the face of an inhumane, unsustainable economic system. But it's about saying we have to do better than that. We have to raise our gaze and take action at the roots. And that's where the economic system comes in. And speaking of that, that's where the next corner of this jigsaw puzzle comes into the story. And this idea of pre-distribution, I think, is one of the most exciting concepts, because it's about saying, yes, there's a role for government in redistributing, reducing the gap between rich and poor through taxes and transfers. But it's about also saying we have to get the market to do much more of the heavy lifting. Because currently the Australian government, through taxes and transfers, reduces the gap between rich and poor by about 1/3, which sounds like a lot and feels like a lot in terms of, the political machinations around a lot of the work around taxes and welfare payments. So what could be better? More worker-owned cooperatives, more community wealth building, true cost accounting, so that we know the real costs of our goods and services, and we're not seeing things artificially cheap because they ignore the environmental and social impact. And speaking of social impact, this is where the 4th corner of the jigsaw puzzle comes in too. This is people-powered, making sure that people feel in control and at the forefront of economic change. And this is where the work of the next economy is utterly so critical, about walking with communities to imagine a better economy that's over the horizon of being dependent on coal. And so getting there is going to require work from communities, from enterprises, but you wanted to hear about government today. So I want to talk about the role of government. I've been told I can't walk around too much, but I want to point out to you the different, component parts of this agenda. So the top goal is what we're really after, and a result where we've met the needs of people and planet. So the wellbeing economy is a penultimate. It's not the goal in and of itself. It's about we need the economy that's helping deliver, enabling that context. So we need a government underneath that's going to help enable the sort of economic system we need. And so that means unpacking the goals and processes of government. So this time start down here. So what are the goals and processes of government? What sort of country do we want to be? Then how do we measure our achievement, our performance, our attainment against that? Then we do the wellbeing analysis to really think about, okay, why are different groups being left further behind? Why are ecosystems at breaking point? What are the root causes of some of the disparities in various dimensions of wellbeing that we discovered through measuring what matters? And then how do we implement different ways of working? How do we use the different levers and instruments of policy to increase the sort of economic activities that we need more of and to power down the sort of economic activities that are not aligned with what people and planet need? And then you go into the budget, and that's how you fund and resource this sort of work, and how you use fiscal levers to encourage certain activities and discourage others. So last July, the government released the Measuring What Matters statement. And it's, work in progress, as they'll admit, and it's getting there in terms of sort of taking a look of how Australia's faring across all different dimensions. But let's go back to this and see where the Measuring What Matters statement fits in. So this is where Measuring What Matters is. Yeah, and they're working hard to improve it. They've moved the data collection to the ABS. They've invested more funds in the ABS, so that's all fantastic. Hopefully this will go on a journey of continuous improvement. Problem is, they skipped this step. They had a bit of a consultation on the Treasury's website in January in Australia. So who responds to consultations on Treasury's websites in January in Australia? People like me. Not everyday people. And so what they've missed out is, and you can understand why last year was a difficult year for a conversation about what matters to Australia, but maybe it's what we need now, is a collective national conversation across Australia about what sort of country we want to be. Because how do you know what matters if you don't ask Australians first? And then here, this bit, they're not really yet starting to grapple with that root cause analysis and thinking about what we need more of and what we need less of in our economy. Maybe starting to explore some different ways of working. We know there's a conversation around the Expenditure Review Committee, and maybe there's a discussion around something called the Budget Process Operational Rules, the BPAWs, but let's wait to see, because we're not yet seeing how these measures are being made to matter in policy making. This is the hard stuff. This is where this agenda starts to get really crunchy. And in terms of wellbeing budget, well, lots of people talk about what Jim Chalmers has done being a wellbeing budget. It's utterly not. It's a long way off being a wellbeing budget. So we'll wait to see. I want to just finish with these two images. You can see I follow on Instagram something called Positive Global News because I'm desperate for a bit of good news story every now and again. And this popped up, and it's a really sweet little story about this guy in the cap who met this chap here, Warren, who was working at a Walmart, and he was well into his 80s, and he was having to keep working because he couldn't afford his house. And so the guy in the cap, Rory, thought that's rubbish, and he created a GoFundMe, and he got some money to support Warren. And so this went viral as being a really beautiful story. And I think it's lovely, but it is downstream, after the fact, individual charity. And I think our task collectively as a movement needs to be to do much better at what Anil Dash is imploring us to do here, is to, yes, recognise those beautiful acts of charity, but really recognise what they are, is that they are just tiny little responses to an inhumane, unsustainable economic system. And collectively, we need to find much better ways to tell a much better story about changing the root causes, changing the economic system, and building the sort of economy we need that meets the needs of people and planet. So thank you so much.